Welcome to Book Nibbles, Big Ideas, Small Bites. Cancer has been part of the human story for as long as there have been humans, and Siddhartha Mukherjee's The Emperor of All Maladies traces its biography in the way one might write about a monarch or a nation. The book does not simply recount facts about the disease, instead it takes us on a sweeping narrative that stretches from ancient Egypt to modern laboratories, blending the intimate stories of patients and doctors with the grand arc of science, politics, and culture. Mukherjee, an oncologist himself, treats cancer not just as a medical condition, but as a historical character. Relentless, shape-shifting, and stubborn, an emperor that has ruled through fear and suffering. The story begins with the earliest written mentions of tumors thousands of years ago in hieroglyphics on papyrus scrolls. The Egyptian physician Imhotep described lumps in the breast and admitted bluntly that there was no treatment. Even in antiquity, the disease appeared to be a riddle, one that mocked human attempts to control it. Unlike infections that come and go or injuries that heal, cancer seemed internal, arising from one's own body, turning the flesh into an enemy within. This paradox, that the very cells that give us life can also betray us, is at the heart of cancer's biography. Mukherjee draws vivid portraits of early attempts to fight this enemy. Ancient Greek physicians debated whether cancer was caused by an excess of black bile, part of the humoral theory that dominated medicine for centuries. The name itself, cancer meaning crab, comes from the way the tumor's swollen blood vessels resembled the claws of a crab clutching onto the body. For hundreds of years, treatments were crude, often brutal. Surgery without anesthesia or antisepsis was an ordeal of blood and screams. Galen, the Roman physician, argued against aggressive surgery because he believed cancer was systemic and could not be cut out. Instead, patients were given poultices or dietary changes, remedies that rarely worked. But even these failures mattered because they showed how stubborn cancer was, how it resisted the simple fixes that had defeated other diseases like smallpox once vaccines arrived. Fast forward to the 19th century when advances in anatomy and surgery transformed the battlefield. The discovery of ether anesthesia in the 1840s and antiseptics in the 1860s made it possible to cut deeper, to remove not just visible tumors but entire sections of the body in a desperate bid to outpace the disease. This era produced larger and larger operations, sometimes grotesquely so. The radical mastectomy pioneered by William Halsted at Johns Hopkins became emblematic of this period. Halsted believed that cancer spread outward in concentric circles, so the surgeon's job was to carve wider and deeper, removing the breast, chest muscles, lymph nodes, anything that might harbor rogue cells. For decades, this operation became almost ritualized, performed with unquestioning faith. Thousands of women underwent the procedure, often left mutilated, their lives extended by months or years, but rarely cured. The radical mastectomy became both a symbol of medical hubris and the desperation of patients who clung to the hope of survival. Mukherjee humanizes these stories by weaving in the voices of patients. He tells of women who submitted to Halsted's knife, hoping for salvation, and of others who resisted, fearing not only death but disfigurement. Their experiences remind us that cancer is not merely a scientific puzzle but a lived ordeal. The emotional toll of the disease, fear, stigma, isolation, runs like an undercurrent through the narrative. In earlier centuries, cancer was often hidden, whispered about as a shameful condition. Patients suffered in silence, sometimes even hiding diagnoses from their families. Part of the biography of cancer is also the slow unshrouding of these taboos, the move toward public acknowledgement and advocacy. By the 20th century, the surgical era collided with new ideas. If cutting deeper did not always work, perhaps medicine could target cancer in another way. This brought the age of chemotherapy. Mukherjee recounts the surprising birth of this field during World War II, when scientists studying nitrogen mustard, a chemical weapon, noticed it suppressed the growth of white blood cells. If a poison could kill fast-dividing immune cells, perhaps it could also attack rapidly dividing cancer cells. This was a radical shift, Instead of removing cancer surgically, doctors might chemically poison it. The first chemotherapy trials were crude, toxic, and often devastating. Patients vomited, lost their hair, and suffered infections because their bone marrow was destroyed along with the tumor. Yet in some cases, the cancer retreated, even if temporarily. One of the most moving stories in Mukherjee's book involves children with leukemia in the 1940s and 1950s. Before chemotherapy, leukemia was a swift death sentence. Parents brought their children to hospitals only to be told nothing could be done. But pioneers like Sidney Farber in Boston refused to accept this. Using antifolase, drugs that interfered with DNA synthesis, Farber achieved brief remissions in children. For the first time, parents saw their children leave the hospital, play, and smile again, even if the reprieve lasted only weeks. Farber's work was revolutionary because it proved cancer could be pushed back, even if only temporarily. He became a tireless advocate, partnering with philanthropists and activists to raise money for research. The Jimmy Fund, born from a radio broadcast about one of Farber's young patients, became one of the most successful fundraising campaigns in medical history. Farber understood that science alone was not enough. Cancer research needed politics, money, and public will. This interplay between science and society is a recurring theme. In the 1970s, cancer became a political issue with President Richard Nixon's declaration of the War on Cancer. Billions of dollars were funneled into research through the National Cancer Act of 1971, and for a time the rhetoric suggested cancer would be conquered as swiftly as polio had been with vaccines. But cancer is not like polio. It is not caused by a single virus or bacterium, but by the corruption of our own cells' machinery. Mukherjee shows how the war metaphor, while inspiring, was also misleading. Progress was slower, incremental, often filled with setbacks. The public, primed for quick victory, grew disillusioned when cancer mortality did not plummet. Yet those investments laid the foundation for molecular biology's revolution in the 1980s and beyond. Scientists discovered oncogenes, genes that when mutated could drive uncontrolled cell growth. They mapped tumor suppressors, the cellular brakes that cancer disables. They uncovered how signaling pathways, normally tightly regulated, could go awry. Cancer was not one disease but hundreds, each with its own genetic fingerprint. This realization reshaped treatment. Instead of one silver bullet, medicine would need a vast arsenal of targeted approaches. One striking example is the story of Gleevec, a drug for chronic myeloid leukemia, CML. By targeting a specific genetic abnormality, the fusion of the BCR and ABL genes, Gleevec turned a once lethal cancer into a manageable condition for many patients. Mukherjee highlights this as a triumph, proof that understanding cancer at the molecular level could yield miracles. But the story is never one of unbroken progress. For every success like Gleevec, there are countless failed drugs, trials that ended in disappointment, and patients who endured treatments that ravaged their bodies without saving them. The tension between hope and despair pervades the book. Mukherjee tells of Mary Lasker, a socialite turned activist, who used her influence to pressure politicians into funding research. She was savvy in marketing cancer as a cause, framing it as a moral battle that deserved the same urgency as war. Without her lobbying, the war on cancer might never have been launched. This reminds us that scientific progress often depends on personalities, on those willing to fight not only in laboratories but in the halls of power. Another striking theme is how cancer forces medicine to confront fundamental questions. How much suffering is acceptable in pursuit of a cure? Is prolonging life for months worth the pain of aggressive treatment? In the 1980s and 1990s, as chemotherapy regimens grew more complex, these questions became more urgent. Some oncologists pushed for combination therapies, bombarding cancer with multiple drugs at once. This sometimes produced remissions but also brought horrific side effects. Patients vomited relentlessly, their immune systems destroyed, their quality of life shattered. Yet for some, those extra months or years mattered. Cancer care became a balancing act between quantity of life and quality of life, between fighting the emperor and living with dignity. Mukherjee also explores the social movements that changed cancer culture. Breast cancer activism in the 1970s and 1980s, led by women who rejected secrecy and stigma, helped shift public perception. The Pink Ribbon campaign, though criticized for commercialization, gave the disease a visibility it had never had. Survivors began speaking openly, marching, lobbying, demanding better treatments and more research. Cancer was no longer hidden. It became part of public discourse. This activism reshaped funding priorities and made patient voices central in medical decision-making. As Mukherjee moves closer to the present, he delves into the rise of genetic sequencing, immunotherapy, and personalized medicine. Immunotherapy, in particular, is portrayed as both a revival of old ideas and a frontier of new hope. The concept that the immune system could be harnessed to fight cancer dates back to the 19th century, when William Coley experimented with bacterial toxins. But only recently have drugs like checkpoint inhibitors, which release the immune system's brakes, shown dramatic results in cancers like melanoma. Some patients, once terminal, experienced long-term remissions. It felt like a revolution, though Mukherjee is careful to note that not all patients respond, and that the emperor remains elusive. What makes the book especially powerful is how Mukherjee oscillates between the macro and the micro. He moves from national policy debates to the story of a single patient in his clinic, from gene maps to the face of a child with leukemia. He reminds us that behind every statistic lies a human being. One poignant example is Carla, a young teacher diagnosed with breast cancer. Mukherjee follows her journey through treatments, remissions, and relapses, illustrating how cancer infiltrates every part of a patient's life: the medical, the personal, the psychological. Carla becomes emblematic of the larger struggle, showing that even in an age of advanced science, the experience of cancer is still raw, human, and deeply personal. Ultimately, the biography of cancer is also a biography of humanity's ingenuity and resilience. The disease forces constant innovation, pushes science to its limits, and challenges society to face mortality. Mukherjee emphasizes that cancer is not an alien invader, but a distorted version of ourselves. Cancer cells use the same genetic code, the same biological machinery as healthy cells. They are us, gone wrong. This makes the fight uniquely difficult but also profound. In battling cancer, we are wrestling with our own biology, our own capacity for growth and renewal. Mukherjee ends on a note of cautious hope. Cancer may never be completely eradicated. It may always be with us as long as we live long enough for cells to mutate. But it can be managed, transformed from a death sentence into a chronic condition, and perhaps someday prevented more effectively through vaccines and genetic interventions. The emperor may not be overthrown, but he can be contained, his power diminished. The key lesson is patience and persistence. Breakthroughs often take decades, and progress is rarely linear. Each generation of scientists builds on the failures and insights of the past. For readers, the book offers not just medical history, but lessons about perseverance, humility, and the human spirit. One takeaway is that complex problems demand complex solutions. There is rarely a single magic bullet. Another is that progress comes not only from science, but from advocacy, funding, and social will. Without Farber's fundraising or Lasker's lobbying, discoveries might have languished. Without patients willing to enroll in trials, treatments would not exist. Everyone, in some way, becomes part of the story. In reflecting on the narrative, one is struck by how cancer mirrors broader struggles. It is about power and resistance, survival and adaptation, despair and hope. Just as cancer cells learn to evade drugs, humans learn to outwit cancer with new strategies. The battle is ongoing, dynamic, never static. That is perhaps why Mukherjee's metaphor of cancer as an emperor is so apt. Like a ruler, cancer adapts, consolidates power, resists overthrow, yet is always vulnerable to rebellion from unexpected corners. Optimism. Cancer may not disappear, but it no longer rules with the absolute terror it once did. Treatments are improving, survivorship is growing, and the Emperor's grip is loosening. The story is unfinished, but it is moving steadily forward. And that's it. The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.